The question of representation of the other is one which is constantly changing depending on where you happen to be, where I happen to be, and there's some fluidity with that in general. Fine. In terms of the notions of an understanding of jihad, the way I understand jihad is that, first of all, there is not a simple definition of jihad upon which all Muslims agree. As an outsider, I look at the debates taking place today on the question of jihad. I even look historically at the theory of jihad which the different schools of laws have developed. I look at the way in which it was consolidated often in the around the 11th, especially 12th century and 13th century. Why so late in Islamic history? Because in fact it was itself developing out of a necessity to respond to the growing dynamics with the Crusaders of the period. So that there's a political context within which particular theories of jihad developed and got consolidated in particular ways. And if we want to understand Roman Catholic understanding of just war theory, it's fascinating that you need to look at those debates of the medieval period with the Muslims. So there's an interdependence at that time, and I would argue there's an interdependence now also, in the sense that notions of what is appropriate in terms of if you are going to use the war, on what basis are you going to do that, within a particular understanding of ethics. There are developments in the West about that, and there are now sort of a renewed interest in debating the issues within the Muslim world. Of course, some people would argue, some Muslims would say that, well, you know, there's this hadith which says that it's not the war in the physical sense which is important, the jihad of self-protection that allows you to actually take up arms to defend yourself, to defend the faith, to defend your community when attacked. But it's much more, that's the, you know, Jihad al-Akbar is really the jihad of the soul, of actually struggling within yourself for your own sort of evil inclinations that you need to overcome as a human being. And so Sufis have put the emphasis on that. Then you have other people who have said, yeah, but look at the isnad behind this particular hadith, and it's a weak isnad. It's not a strong isnad, and therefore will dismiss that particular tradition and actually want to emphasize a more a stronger notion of jihad in the sense that the jihad really is about being able to defend oneself and use some attacks. And then you have some of the more some groups today in the Muslim world that are going to say that in some ways to be able to do particular strikes at the Americans or at the Canadians or at the Westerners, if they are doing in majority Muslim countries through their armies predominantly, if they have a presence which is a threat to and an imposition on us as a majority Muslim, then therefore they will justify some form of terrorist attack. And so there is a variety of ways in which jihad is interpreted today. And so when I teach that particular part within my introduction to Islam, I make sure that I represent that diversity of worldviews and understand that it is not only an internal, intra-Islamic debate today, but that intra-Islamic debate is constantly one which is influenced by non-Muslims, especially Western pressures, asking people to explain themselves. And depending on which Muslim we ask, on where they are, which kinds of identities they have, where are they socially in relationship to possible interest with the West or lack of interest with the West, they will side and will define the question of jihad differently. So it's a very complicated issue. So that would be my relatively long answer to your specific question one. On your second questions of Westerns and democracy and hypocrisy, I think that this is a challenge that we all face as human beings. It's very easy to pinpoint to what we perceive to be the problems in somebody else's incoherent behavior, the gap between what they say their ideals are and the way in which we perceive their behavior to be. It's very easy. We do it with our kids, but sometimes as parents, we are not necessarily as coherent as we would like to, and sometimes our kids tell us that also. So part of the challenge to me is I talked about pluralism and whatnot. The Canadian sort of ideal of pluralism is not perfect either, and it's constantly changing and tries to improve. One of the challenges, precisely, is the way in which the politics of Canadian foreign policy, especially in terms of the military presence in Afghanistan today, is one which is heavily debated in Canada at the moment. Those people who support a national unity, monocultural kind of Canada, or maybe not monocultural, but an assimilationist approach to Canadian identity. Those are the people who, in general, want to use the armed forces in order to protect the interest of the Afghan people, according to them, especially the rights of women to be liberated from the Taliban, and therefore see that presence, in fact, in terms of pride that Canadians are involved abroad in trying to protect human rights and the fragile new democratic developments in Afghanistan today. Of course, there's a lot of people within Canada who would respond and say, no, this is not the best way to promote, in fact, the development of local decision-making on the part of a broader percentage of the population of Afghanistan, whether that is in a Western democratic sense or whether it's in a more tribal, traditional Muslim sense, that using Canadian taxpayers' money to develop, to increase development cooperation programs is a more effective way of promoting those human rights values and so on and so forth. And so there's a strong debate in Canada on these issues. It's debated in the middle of the Parliament. And so I would beg you to understand that while I did not raise it in my presentation, that the very tensions about pluralism and multiculturalism, which I talked about, are reflected in the ways in which the people side for or side against that particular presence there. I'm heavily aware that Canada has also had some policies regarding the Israeli-Palestinian questions, which has been problematic in terms of what I understand to be a pluralist approach, to a balanced approach, and to also a more systemic and steady and coherent critique of human rights abuse in that context, as well as an effort to promote a balanced dialogue. It has been promoting a balanced dialogue, but not always, because of our new government at the moment, has not always, I think, understood that by reacting the way it did in the early election of the Hamas, it actually was contradictory to some degree, at least in my opinion, as a Canadian citizen, to its willingness or its desire to promote a just solution to the conflict, which it has been doing since Madrid, in terms of, for example, making sure that leading the international community in the efforts towards the particular questions of Palestinian refugees. So there are mixed messages in some ways, I would argue, that are coming out at times of Canadian behavior in terms of foreign policy. And by being self-critical in front of you today is in part, I think, what we need more of. Because if I become more self-critical, then I think that it allows others to also be more self-critical, because we realize that we need each other's help to understand the situation in our respective areas and countries without pointing fingers as if I have it all and you don't know and you need to change and I'm already perfect. It's a simplistic and arrogant approach, and unfortunately some of these arrogant approaches have been policies in some Western countries, foreign policies for a little too long, and we need to be a little more humble in the way in which we approach the complexities of the challenges we all face internationally today.
Translate this.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes. Please.
كان ملاحظة الأخ أن يعني بالنسبة لنا أنت الآخر، وهناك قضية يعني في الغرب عن مفهوم الجهاد، وهذا يسبب تشويه للعالم الإسلامي.